Today, Turkey is quite possibly the most powerful nation in the modern Middle East. It rose from being an almost dead nation after World War I to being a regional power and a secular democratic modern nation. The major reason for this is Ataturk, his real name being Mustafa, son of Ali Riza. He helped modernize Turkey and helped it survive in several wars to the present. His ceremonial name, Ataturk, literally translates to father of the Turks, so important is he to the Turkish nation. So, what if Ataturk never existed? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. In this timeline, Ataturk is simply never born. The lack of the beginning of his life would not wildly change history. Some people will say in the comments that without him the Young Turks movement would have never succeeded, because he's just that magical. But the Young Turks movement was caused and succeeded because of long-term issues Ataturk had no power over. He fought in practically every Turkish war at the start of the 20th century, but he simply did not have the seniority to change history until World War I. Ataturk definitely made a decisive impact on the Gallipoli front in World War I. Ataturk's leadership and strategies kept the Ottomans fighting and effectively won the battle, so without him, the British and their empire would have won at Gallipoli. A British victory at Gallipoli would have resulted in a British seizure of Constantinople and an opening for Allied trade through the Dardanelles. This would not have been decisive for the war. The chain reaction that the British believed would spiral across the Balkans after the fall of Constantinople, thus destroying the Central Powers, would never have happened. It seems impossible to have the British moving large armies to the Balkans to try to conquer Bulgaria, and even if they got close, the Austrian and German armies could have ground them to a bloody standstill. Also, the opening of Allied shipping through the Dardanelles to Russia would not have saved Russia. The British could already get shipping to Russia via Archangel and Murmansk in the north, and there is no way the British would have been able to send a major army to Crimea or Bessarabia that would have been able to change the fate of the war in any way. The change for Turkey would be amazing. The Turkish government would fall back onto Anatolia and effectively become a punchline. The Allies, still having to win the war against the Germans, would not put the hundreds of thousands of men necessary into subduing the heart of Turkey, and the region would remain in Turkish hands. The severe weakening of the Turks would have resulted in the Sykes-Picot Agreement fully playing out. For those of you that don't know, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was the original agreement on how the Allies planned on dividing up the Middle East after the Ottomans had lost the war, and this would have resulted in much of what we consider southeast Turkey today falling into French hands. After the end of World War I, the Greeks invaded Turkey to conquer western Turkey. The Turks defeated them in our timeline. However, Ataturk effectively single-handedly won the Greco-Turkish War, creating an army out of basically nothing to fight the Greeks and even going against the official government, who were allied puppets to fight against the Greeks. This would mean that without Ataturk, the Turks would have lost and western Turkey would have become Greek. The division of Turkey was supposed to happen something like this. What people often forget, and what actually I never knew until I started researching for this video, was that the Italians had a claim to a massive part of Turkey on the south coast. In our timeline, being the 20th century Italians, they gave up claim to it after the Greeks were losing the war. However, if the Greeks had won the war, and if the Turks weren't putting much of a fight, the Italians would have seized their claim. However, the division of Turkey would have probably looked something more like this, because the Greeks would have done the lion's share of the fighting, and so their claim would have grown, and since the Italians would be coming in at the last second, their claim would have shrunk. The reason Mussolini rose to power was that the Italians felt that they had lost the war, since they had put so much effort into fighting the war, but got no new territories for their sacrifice. If the Italians had gained large tracts of territory from the Turks, they would feel they had won the war, and Mussolini would never have risen to power. Thus, Italy would have remained a moderate monarchy. Without Ataturk's modernization, Turkey would be a very different country. Ataturk had transformed a heavily Islamic, backwards-looking society into a modern, secular one. These reforms, which I don't have time to mention, were so far-reaching and large that if he never existed, no one else would do them. Without Ataturk removing him, the Sultan would survive as the technical leader of Turkey. Turkey would go on a similar path as much of the Middle East, with a few would-be reformers, but all eventually failing since they would not have the fame or skill of Ataturk. In the end, Turkey would have similar levels of development as the neighboring Islamic countries like Syria and Iraq had in our timeline. This different Eastern Mediterranean would lead to a very different World War II. Italy, being a moderate monarchy, would remain neutral in World War II. World War II is basically the war of those who violently wanted to conquer things versus those who less violently wanted to conquer things and those who were happy with their borders. I mean, just compare the membership and the size of the Allies against the Axis. The Allies had many continent-sized nations, while the Axis were mainly small nations. Turkey, being bitter about losing the war against the Greeks, would side with the Axis. The Greeks, meanwhile, having an empire of moderate size they'd want to protect, and wanting to be on whatever side the Turks weren't on, would side with the Allies. This rivalry would drag the Germans into the Balkans, and even without the Italians, the Germans would still conquer Greece. The Germans would use their position in Turkey to attack into the Russian Caucasus. The Germans driving from the south would seize the Caucasus and the oil fields, and thus allow them to continually fight a war of attrition. They would meet up with the German army coming across from Ukraine, and would seize the entire southern part of Russia, thus securing the campaign goals of the Stalingrad campaign. The German army in Turkey would press into a lightly defended French Syria and British Mesopotamia. The Germans would likely be able to conquer the barely defended Mesopotamia, and in name be able to conquer the British-occupied South Iran with almost no fighting. Without Italy in the war, there would be no North Africa and Italian front. Thus, the Germans would be attacking purely from across the Levant into Egypt. North Africa showed that the Germans were adept at open desert warfare, and with direct ties to Europe existing through Turkey, the Germans would probably be able to seize the Suez. With the fall of the Suez, British power in the Mediterranean would quickly diminish. Malta would likely fall to the Germans without support from Egypt, and possibly Franco might join the Axis, thus leading to the seizure of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean becoming an Axis lake. In our timeline, there were two Western Allied plans on how to destroy the Third Reich. The American plan was an invasion of northern France in 1942 or 43, while the British was an invasion of North Africa and Italy, striking through what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. In our timeline, the British plan was the past plan, and the American plan of an invasion of northern France had to wait until 1944. However, in this timeline, with the Russians losing ground to the Germans, and it appearing like Russia was losing the war, it would appear that something drastic would have to be done for the Soviets to survive, and the quick and direct American attack would also appear the best. Also, with Italy out of the war, a Mediterranean strategy would not seem to work, because it's a much larger jump from Tunisia to France than it is from Tunisia to Italy. An Anglo-American invasion of Normandy in 1943 would be a failure. The U.S. Army was simply not battle-hardened or developed enough for the task, and any such invasion would be horribly rushed. Look at the first few months of North Africa, where the Germans inflicted humiliating defeats on the Americans, and that was a side theater for the Germans. Even in our timeline, if Hitler made the right decisions at the right time, he could have easily defeated the Allies at Normandy. I know some people say that the Atlantic Wall was not yet constructed, and so it would balance out. This would be a factor, but the prior factors would still mean that a U.S. defeat would happen. With the failure at Normandy, the Western Allies would be unable to find another way back onto the continent. Landing a major American army in British India and having them fight their way across the Middle East and up the Balkans to Berlin is ridiculous. The German victory would make the German army look unstoppable, and so would make the public terrified and wary of the idea of reconquering all of Europe and what the toll of such a war would be. North Africa would be locked out because without Italy in the war, it would mean there'd be no springboard to get from North Africa onto Europe. And also, with the Germans probably being very powerful in the Mediterranean, it would mean that a whole Mediterranean front would be much harder. The war in Russia would simply go on forever. The Germans with Caucasus oil and Ukrainian grain could fight an endless war of attrition. Russia, however, is so massive that the Germans would be unable to conquer it. The fighting would likely end in the 1950s, with both sides simply so exhausted they could no longer keep fighting. A border would likely be drawn along the lines of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty from the end of World War I, except the Germans would take the Caucasus. The Russians would likely push the Germans out of southern Iran, based out of their occupational territory in northern Iran. This would be because the Germans would simply be so far from home that their supply lines and their troop numbers would barely exist. Also, this would mean that Iran would become a Soviet puppet state and a communist state. In the East, the Americans and the British would still defeat the Japanese, and East Asia would fall into the U.S. sphere of influence. The Russians would be too busy fighting for their survival or exhausted to help support worldwide communist movements. For example, the nationalists would win in China, and the US would reconquer Cuba from the communists, etc. Eventually, the British and the Americans would sign a peace treaty, probably giving Vichy France recognition for its territories in North Africa after the rest of the French Empire had been picked off by the Allies. Allied usage of the Suez Canal and giving the Germans and their Turkish allies regions in the Middle East would also probably be included. This is very similar to my What If the Germans Won World War II timeline, which Hitler never declares war on the US after Pearl Harbor, the link to which is in the description. The gist of it is that the US and the Third Reich enter a Cold War with each other. The Nazis in the end lose the Cold War and collapse since they're simply so awful to their subject peoples. The major difference from that timeline from this timeline would be that the British Empire would survive. Ironically, the Americans would probably prop up the remainder of the British Empire so that the new countries would not be subverted or conquered by the Nazis, with the most likely outcomes being that the British Empire would survive in its traditional form, or that the new countries that would be founded would simply be British puppets. Turkey would be a German puppet during the Cold War with a pro-Western fascist government. After the Cold War, however, there would probably be a traditional Islamist backlash, with a government similar to Saudi Arabia in our timeline. What if Altist? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next video. Thank you.